Okay, so welcome to Eat, Move, Think, the show about optimal wellness brought to you by Medcan.
Wow. Do it again.
Oh, I was practicing. Okay, ready?
Welcome
to Eat, Move, Think,
the show about
optimal
wellness brought to you by
Medcan.
Yeah, this is extremely good. Thank you.
Jazz, you know our Move host, Dr. Andrew Miners?
Of course.
Have you heard him talk about strength training?
A little bit, yeah. We've done a few interviews with him about strength training.
He's a big fan.
An expert, I would say. He knows a lot about the different benefits of strength training.
I want to talk about a place. It's at McMaster University. It's called the Physical Activity Center of Excellence.
Wow.
And
that sounds nice.
You have to walk through it to get to Stuart Phillips, who's our guest today. He's a professor of kinesiology at McMaster. He's an expert in strength training.
Right.
To go see Stu, you walk through what is essentially a gym filled with older people. These are people in their 70s and 80s doing bench press, they're doing squats. They're on ellipticals or exercise bikes, like almost exclusively people who are older than 55.
Yeah.
And actually, most of them would be 70 and 80.
And that's certainly not the thing you see in your average gym these days.
No. But if you ask Dr. Andrew Miners what the ideal gym would look like if everybody who should be strength training was actually strength training, then it would be that. It would be filled with people who are older because strength training gets more important, not less important as you age.
I'm Jasmine Ratch.
I'm Chris Shulgin. We're the producers of Eat, Move, Think.
So in this episode, Dr. Andrew Miners is talking to Dr. Stuart Phillips from McMaster University, and they're going to give you the complete guide to strength training for people who don't think that strength training is for them.
Yeah, it's an argument for strength training for everyone.
Not just for their bodies, but also for their brains.
There's a saying that aerobic exercise, so like jogging or swimming, helps you live longer, but strength training, resistance training helps you live better.
Right.
You know, keeps you capable, keeps you active, keeps you vibrant, doing the things that young people do well into your 60s, 70s, 80s, and beyond.
That's right. And Dr. Phillips and Dr. Miners are also going to break down just how much strength training you need to get the most benefit. And it's actually not as much as you might think.
So if you want to get inspired to strength training, to start strength training, this is the episode for you. Let's hear from Dr. Andrew Miners and Dr. Stuart Phillips. Here's Dr. Andrew Miners.
Hi, everybody. Welcome back to Eat, Move, Think. I'm Dr. Andrew Miners, and the Clinical and Product Director of Sports Medicine, Therapy, Rehabilitation, and Fitness here at Medcan. And you'll be happy to know that we have a returning visitor to Eat, Move, Think, Dr. Stuart Phillips. So welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me on the show, Andrew. Appreciate being here.
Let's get to know you a bit. So I know you're a PhD in kinesiology at McMaster. So tell me a little bit about your background and what's your own experience with strength and resistance training and how that led you to do research in this area.
Yeah, so I've been at McMaster now for 27 years, and the tissue in the middle of our research program has been skeletal muscle. And then as I've gotten older, my interests have shifted a little bit, and I'm now the director of something called the Physical Activity Center of Excellence, which has 500 community members that come in from various different populations, but the average age is about 73. And so I've become more interested in mitigation of the decline in strength and muscle as we age, which, as you probably know, and your listeners probably know, we call sarcopenia. Mm-hmm. But that's something that has taken up, I think, the last, I would say, half of my research time here.
Interesting. And just for our listeners, just to reiterate, so sarcopenia is the gradual reduction of muscle mass over time, correct?
Yeah, muscle mass. And then now the definitions incorporate strength and then physical function as well. So what people can do in a given day.
Excellent. Okay. And congratulations on your recent publication, which just came out this month or last month, I guess July. We're just in July, from the British Journal of Sports Medicine, which is a pretty prestigious journal. So congratulations on that publication. And that publication was on resistance training prescription for muscle strength and hypertrophy in healthy adults, a systematic review and Bayesian network meta-analysis. So that's a lot of complex words in that title, but we're going to get into that a bit. But before we do that, what do you feel is the general thought around resistance training in the population, or is it variable based on age?
Yeah, I think your characterization, this is an activity that you need to go to the gym, and it's Arnold Schwarzenegger type physiques that dominate people's impression, I think, of what strength training or resistance training is. But I think it's beginning to shift a little bit. And there's certainly, and I think, an increasing awareness particularly amongst older individuals and primary care people who prescribe health for these individuals, that they should be stronger or try and resist the decline in strength that's going to happen as a part of age. What we're trying to do is to slow that decline.
And that's why recent research has shown that adding resistance training on top of cardiovascular training can reduce your all-cause mortality.
Yeah, and I think that that's something people probably don't know overly well. I mean, I think people are mostly familiar with if I do some cardiovascular exercise, I go for a walk, I go for a run. These are the activities that are associated with reductions in specific disease risk and all-cause mortality. But as you point out, if you add resistance training to those activities, you reduce your risk even further, which at least suggests that there's something different going on with resistance training. And I certainly think that mobility as you get older is something that is a function mostly in older people anyway, of strength and muscular power.
Absolutely. In my older patients, 70 plus, and I see patients into their 80s, lower limb strength is so important. Like upper limb strength is too, but the ability to get up and down out of the chair, up and down off of the toilet, which comes down to lower limb strength. I always tell patients in their older, resistance training is more important as you get older, not less. And it sounds like the research supports that.
Yeah, no, I think you're spot on. But as I've gotten older, I've just got a growing appreciation for what it means to be. You don't have to be the strongest person in the room by any stretch of the imagination. But where you don't want to be is down in the lower quartile or quintile, the lower 20 or 30% of the people in terms of strength, or the weaker people, because those are the people that they struggle with, as you say, getting in and out of a chair, but also moving around their house and doing it efficiently. And that leads at some point to a loss in physical mobility, and then you're dependent. And, we know the story from there on out.
Let's get now in adding into the research paper. So what are some specific things that resistance training can help with in terms of your overall health?
Yeah, I mean, I think I need to have a caveat to say, you say my research paper, and certainly
your team's research paper.
I had a role in it, but I need to acknowledge Brad Currier and now Dr. Jonathan McLeod, who were two graduate students of mine who were the lead protagonists in the work.
Yeah, the lead author. Sorry,
we are part of a team. No, in seriousness, it's a sort of an interesting way of looking at the research. What we did was essentially search for all of the known trials that are published on exercise training.
Which I'm sure there was a lot, right?
There was a lot, yeah. We started out with 12,000 results that we had to sift through. And then we sort of distilled it down to close to about 200 different studies that incorporated about 5,000 individuals, ranging in age from as young as 18 to as old as people in their mid-90s. And then we looked for combinations of resistance training variables. So loads, are they heavier, lighter? Sets, is it one set or is it multiple sets? And then frequency, how many times a week that they trained, and tried to see what the optimal, or if you like, best combination of those three variables was to perpetuate gains in strength or increases in muscle mass.
Interesting. And that's what this Bayesian network meta-analysis means. So the network means that you're able to tease out some of those individual variables, as opposed to just looking at, does this exercise prescription better than that exercise prescription, but trying to tease out sets, repetitions, and frequency, correct?
That's exactly spot on. Yeah. I mean, people, I think, might be familiar with the systematic review part is just systematically searching the literature. And that, you end up with a lot of results and you take a lot of time to go through it. And believe me, it was a painstaking process that took a good part of the lockdown during COVID, to be honest. And then it's extraction of that data. And we're not comparing higher versus lower loads. We're looking at the combinations of those three variables. And so we're trying to figure out the combination that works best.
Interesting. And so your team in this research paper is, to everybody's knowledge, the largest research project of its time, looking at multiple randomized controlled trials. So this is sort of the gold standard right now of what we have looking at resistance training and prescription of resistance training programs.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, 5,000 and 6,000 people were the numbers of people we had for the muscle growth and then the strength analysis. And interestingly, equal numbers, almost virtually, of men and women, which is also quite unique, quite a spread of ages. And so, yes, it's the largest analysis that's ever been done out there to try and answer this question.
And what was your question and what were your answers?
So the question was, is there one prescription or one combination of those variables that we talked about? So load, sets, and number of times that people exercised a week that promoted the best gains in strength or the best gains in muscle? The answer was, perhaps, it's a little underwhelming in that all of our comparisons are anchored to a control group that did nothing.
So this is exercise versus nothing.
Correct. Yeah. So a control group, that's...
Right. That's what a control group is.
Yeah. If it were a drug, we would compare it to a placebo. Well, that's exactly what our analysis anchored. It's sort of, I'll call it, fundamental comparison to. And, go figure, strength training of just about any form works. In other words, you get stronger and you gain a little bit of muscle. I think it probably would surprise nobody to know that if you want to get stronger or the strongest, lift heavy things. That seems self-evident, but that's the one of the take-home messages. But interestingly enough, the prescription for muscle growth is more a function of just doing a little bit more volume. And so the loads don't have to be heavier, but a number of sets needs to be a little bit greater. And if you can work out twice or more times per week, then you're going to gain more muscle.
I did the National Strength and Conditioning Association Certified Strength and Conditioning Specialist certification when I first graduated school, a million years ago. And they talked about that too. You're like, when you're lifting strength, do lower repetitions, higher loads. And if you're looking for hypertrophy, do moderate loads with higher repetitions to more failure.
Yeah.
That's basically what you're supporting.
Yeah, essentially. I think we've changed a little bit people's thinking on whether the load needs to be heavier or lighter with respect to hypertrophy. So it appears that that matters far less than what people initially thought. And so long as you reach, we use the word failure, but really that's fatigue, in other words. And I don't think you have to go to absolute, the last repetition, you need a spotter to rack the weight, but you need to come close to that. And, down in our center, we use lots of perception scales. And so rating of perceived exertion to say,
how hard are you working?
Yeah, a 7, 8 out of 10. I don't need you to go to a 9 or a 10 out of 10. That's not necessary. But can you get into that orange zone or that yellow or, close to the red zone?
Right. Where 0 is no effort and 10 is maximal effort.
Correct.
Or maximal discomfort, I guess you could say.
Maximal discomfort. Right. Exactly.
We've got 30 personal trainers at Medcan. And if you're watching them in the gym, they have different approaches to how they're prescribing exercise and they would all have a rationale, right? They'd say, well, for this patient, or this individual, has a resistance background. So we're doing higher loads, power lifts, stuff like that. This person's new to resistance training, so we're doing this. If we go on the internet, there's a lot of talking heads that you need to do supersets or you need to do pyramids, which is, building, starting from high to low or going from low to high or going from low to high and then back down to low again. All of these variables that is talked about in fitness magazines and fitness mythology. How do those things that people say, or hey, the latest, greatest fad in resistance training, how does your research relate to that?
Yeah, I think this is where the rubber hits the road a little bit. The number of variables that you can manipulate is, it's almost infinite. It could be machines, it could be free weights, as you point out, deload schemes, pyramid schemes, cluster sets, et cetera, et cetera. I think that the more complex the prescription, that begins to move into very specific, I'll call it athlete-driven models of performance. Football, rugby, ice hockey, baseball, basketball, doesn't matter. You can come up with a loading scheme or schemes that would be specific for those athletes. And, the principle that's based on is really the principle of specificity. What do you really want to get out of your training? We know that when we survey people and we say, who does strengthening exercise? So first, I take this with a grain of salt because it's self-report. And the latest statistics are between 20 to 30 people.
20 to 30% of people?
Percent, yeah. I think the reality is it's probably closer to about half of that. And if that's the case, then most people are doing nothing. And so, something is better than nothing. And then the argument is like, so how much more of something is better or betterer?
Right.
And I think the answer is that, if we can decomplicate things, I hope all your trainers would sort of take that to heart and say, the best prescription for strength training is the one that gets the person in the gym and allows them to come back next week or, twice a week or whatever it is and do it again.
as opposed to making it overly complicated or overly hard. So it creates too much discomfort, delayed onset muscle soreness. And like, I don't want to I have patients that mistaken that as an injury. Often. Yeah. And it could be if it's extreme.
Yeah. I mean, soreness is almost inevitable, right? And so we work pretty hard when we get new clients into PACE to say, you're going to feel a little bit sore, but that's normal. But what we want for them to do is obviously to come back, on Thursday or next Thursday and, the following. And so they keep doing it. And surely that's should be the mantra of anybody working with most folks.
Totally. And I think that's really important to make sure that our listeners get, which really what you're getting down to is dosage. Like bodybuilders do super dosing, like 5, 6, 7 days a week, split workouts, morning and afternoon. And then most of you talk about in terms of frequency is twice per week. And so what is the minimal dosage to get benefit, or what is the minimal dosage to get maximal benefit, I guess is a better way to say it. Right.
And it's interesting to hear you use the word dosage, because I think when we first sat down, Brad, Jonathan, and I, and we said, we started to talk about this. I said, imagine that resistance exercise is a drug. And so if the load is the dose, then the sets are, how many times you take the dose. And then, the weekly frequency is, how many times a week do I have to take this drug to say, what do I get back in terms of response? We're getting, I think, much closer to defining that minimal dose for quote unquote optimal or meaningful benefit. And it's probably a lot less than people think. Having said that, I still think twice a week is what I'd recommend, something that targets multiple sets. And the load specific to your goals. If strength is your goal, then by all means lift heavier weights, but don't lift it to the extent that if you're going to hurt yourself or injure yourself. And that's my long-term training goal now, is very much, no pain. And I'm like, no pain, but still benefit. And the event horizon for where, this is taking me is decades into the future. It's not I'm not preparing for a competition. I'm not trying to be the top or put a medal around my neck. I'm training for health. And so if people look at it from that perspective, then the event horizon is a very long one, and you want to do something that's sustainable. Right.
And I was curious about one question within the research paper that your team published. It talks about higher load, multi-set, thrice weekly training. I love the word thrice. Yes. Was highest ranked for strength, whereas higher load multi-set twice weekly training was highest ranked for hypertrophy. And that was in the abstract, but later on in the discussion session, it doesn't really mention that thrice again. Everything sort of relates back to twice.
Yeah. So the truth is that statistically, there actually wasn't an awful lot of difference, but we used a method that tries to get across the principle of, in all probability, what is the best? And so the takeaway is it's at least twice, but it could be 3 times if you have the time to do it and the means. And at the same time, you can tolerate that. I try to put the shoe on the other foot for my students. Everybody here is drinking the Kool-Aid, like resistance training is good. How could you not do resistance training? And I said, okay, let's switch it around. And let's say we're all smokers, and they all go, oh. And I'm like, yeah, but like how much smoking is the best kind of smoking? And they're like, it's not even the same. And I'm like, well, your disgust is for some people how they view resistance training. So let's try and give them a sort of a minimal dose of not smoking, but how little they could smoke and still be healthy, if that's the right way of saying it. And they sort of begin to go, oh, I kind of see the logic. And the truth is that it's probably twice, 3 times if you have the means, heavier if you want to be stronger, but the weight really doesn't matter if you want to be just a little bit bigger and gain some muscle mass or retain muscle mass.
I was interested because, usually you think about hypertrophy being more frequent. Yeah. Right? More reps, more sets. But what you just said makes a lot of sense. And I like your thought experiment with your students to sort of think of this as a negative thing, because they're all coming at it, this is good for you. Everybody should do this. I always find that interesting why we separate strength and mass, because it seems like there would be a correlation, meaning that as you increase strength, you increase mass, and as you increase mass, you increase strength. So maybe you can talk a little bit about the differences between strength and hypertrophy or growth. And are they linked? Are they the same thing?
No, they're not the same thing, but they're linked, definitely. I mean, I think the important point to make is that if we accept that the paper's conclusions around gaining muscle, or let's say they're robust, in other words, it tends not to matter, but maybe a little bit more volume drives muscle growth. The thing that really then drives gains in strength is really what we call a neurological phenomenon. In other words, it's a practice phenomenon. So if you've ever watched powerlifters train, so, the classic power lifts are squat, deadlift, bench. These folks, when they come into the gym, warm up for a long time, and then they put multiple plates on each side and they do one repetition. And then they walk away and people are like, oh, what a waste of time for just one repetition. But remember, that's their sport. Right. So they practice doing that and they get better at doing that. A lot of times when you look at these men and women, they are not the most seemingly on the outside muscular individuals because they tend to not be as well toned and defined as bodybuilders.
Right. They don't look like bodybuilders.
But believe me, they have very big muscles underneath. They're just the physique aspect or the lean aspect that bodybuilders seek is not what they care about. The reality is it's a neurological phenomenon of your brain talking to all of the motor units to activate all of the muscle fibers to fire at once and generate that instantaneous power.
Better at the movement.
It's the old adage, if you want to get better at doing the, insert test, task or whatever, then practice doing the task. So the closer we get to your 1RM, so if you're lifting at 80, 90, 95, you're much, much closer.
One repetition
exactly.
max. Yeah.
So at some point, maybe to get strong, you certainly need muscle mass, but but practice the lift that you want to compete in for sure.
Further on in your paper, there's talk about, again, looking at hypertrophy in untrained versus trained. And this might be a little bit interesting to our listeners too, because if you're new to resistance training, and this links to some of the neurological adaptation to strength training that we see early. If you haven't worked out for a while or you haven't worked out at all and you start at really low loads, what we see with people is that they have a relatively rapid increase in strength initially. And that's why people say, oh, wow, I'm getting so much stronger, so much faster. But then it plateaus. And that's when we have the physiological adaptation to strength training, where we start to actually see growth in our tissues. So muscle fiber hypertrophy, growing more muscle. Is that what works?
I think that it's fair to say the physiological or the changes in fiber size happen sooner than we once thought, but they're definitely the initial increases you get in strength. They're just a matter of practice. Your brain gets better at talking to your muscles. Your muscles get more efficient at coordinating muscle fibers being activated synchronously.
Motor control adaptation.
Motor adaptation, exactly. And then with time, that's when the growth begins to be seen. I think that's still a fair approximation of what we think is happening for most people. If we took a complete novice and said, here, shoot a free throw, they're not very good at it. And then, you train free throws every day for 10 weeks, so you get better. Now, you may not be as good as the best of the best, but that's the cruel nature trick that says, well, we're not all going to be great at everything we practice, right? So whether you believe that's 10,000 hours or not, but we get better at doing things that we practice up to a certain point, I would imagine.
Makes sense. And so generally for untrained individuals, you can still achieve larger gains in mass without going to full failure. But maybe if you're more of an experienced resistance trainer, you're going to be more tolerant to those higher repetitions and loading, and that, challenging your musculoskeletal system a little bit more aggressively is more possible or more tolerated if you're more of a trained individual.
Yeah, exactly. I think a lot of people's reaction to our paper has been, well, everybody knows that something is better than nothing. And what's new? Well, the reality of what's new is that nowhere in the paper do we say, don't progress. Right. In other words, if your max lift started out at 20 pounds, and you can do your max lift multiple times, and you're still interested in progressing and getting better, don't keep lifting 20 pounds, lift 30 or lift 25 or whatever you can tolerate. Most people are going to hit a plateau or a ceiling at some point. And then you have to ask yourself, what's the goal at that point? Do I really want to push myself? Certainly, both you and I, when we were younger, we would say, absolutely, bring it on, give me more. That's not the message for me these days. At a certain point, the system reaches a maximum of what it can tolerate. And then, nature's cruelest trick, right? Which is, the genetics that you had from day one. So
right.
I always joke and say, pick your mom and dad wisely and hopefully things will work out, right?
Absolutely. The things we can't really control. Exactly.
Yeah. And it's a tough one, right? And it's a tough one, I think, for a lot of people to sort of, swallow going back. And I'm like, but not everybody is great at everything. And I don't mean that in a pejorative sense or that we shouldn't strive to be as good as that we can be, but not everybody is going to be the bestest in a particular task.
Makes sense. The overall theme that resistance training is good for you and maybe more important for as we get older to maintain function and therefore prevent other disease and illness and health. And that when we say something is better than nothing, starting off once a week, if you just get in there and do a little bit, and then building up to a target around 2 to 3 times per week. And then as you get more strong, you start to experience improved gains. You can do the same exercise easier, then challenge yourself by adding a little bit more load or a little bit more repetitions, and you start to grow. And that's sort of that progressive idea. But now that I'm a hair away from 50 now, and I fell off the wagon where I wasn't going to the gym as frequently or at all, truth be told, and I've just repurchased a gym membership. Yeah. So I've been going twice a week, and so it makes me feel better.
Yeah.
But hey, we're probably on the right track.
Vindication. Exactly.
Yeah, vindication. Yeah. And now I feel better saying twice as good because it's the time commitment and knowing that I can still get benefit from that twice a week is really reassuring.
Yeah, and I think when you ask most people why they do or they don't do, insert form of exercise, they'll say, I don't have time. That's what they self-report. Right. My colleague, and he's been on your show as well, Marty Gabala, who uses high-intensity interval training, would argue, well, I can give you benefit if you can just give me 40 minutes a week, 2 20-minute sessions. And people, I think, would still be like, So my lay psychoanalysis of I don't have time is actually more appropriately phrased. I have time, but I don't value what it is that you're asking me to do enough to make the time.
Right.
That's not a pejorative. It's just that people's understanding or people's willingness to go to the gym. So it does, of course, it's not just the time for the workout, the time to get to the gym, the time to be at the gym, the time to have the shower afterwards, and then fit that into a day that includes your job, your kids, your partner, all of life's other stresses that we have to deal with. And it's not that I'm unsympathetic to people who say that they don't have time. So, the mission for me is to say to people, I get it. We don't have time, but I'm going to give you something back that hopefully you value enough because it's going to improve your health enough. And it's going to, in those years when you really are beginning to quote unquote, enjoy the fruits of your labor, maybe you're retired, maybe you've got something to look forward to, a trip, kids, whatever it is, that you're able to do it in the best state of health and physical mobility that you can. And I think, as you said, resistance training, just like being cardiovascularly fit, is a key part of that.
Yeah. A healthy longevity, I like to call it.
Yeah.
We want to live longer, but we want to live longer healthily.
Health span. It's all about health span. So health span and lifespan.
Health span. That's a good word. I like that one. And cardiovascular fitness, because we think about cardiovascular fitness as being, going for a brisk walk or riding a bike or going for a run. But resistance training also challenges your cardiovascular system and can be helpful in that respect too. Is that correct?
It certainly can. And I think if anybody's ever done quick circuit workouts where you're doing a whole body workout, minimal rest, I've done a few of those. I don't even use weights. It's done with resistance bands and my own body weight. So push-ups and circuits with bands. I can get my heart rate up at the end of that pretty much within a beat or two of what I can do maximum on a bike or a treadmill. So it certainly feels like it's challenging my cardiovascular system. Endurance may be at one end of the spectrum and resistance at the other, but you can make them much closer and overlap simply by mimicking aspects of one with the other. So if you want to be stronger in your legs and you only have a bike, then pedal uphill. It's a resistive stimulus that's going to make you stronger for sure.
Well, that's excellent. I always say if you only have that 20 or 30 minutes, and maybe your colleague would support this too, is doing an interval-based workout where you're doing multiple joints, multiple body parts, you're doing quick transitions with minimal rest, you're getting a strength and a cardiovascular benefit. And what we also know, that more and more research coming out that even benefits around mental health with exercise. And even resistance training can be beneficial for your mental health. That's also true? Is that not right?
It is. And I have a great colleague here, Dr. Jennifer Heiss.
I had an interview with her earlier. She's excellent. Yeah.
Yeah, you've got the perfect segue. I mean, like if you had told me 10 years ago that exercising changes the shape of a certain portion of our brain, I'd have been like, come on, like whatever.
Right.
But it does, so live and learn. And again, if you told me that if we put serotonin reuptake inhibitors head to head against resistance exercise, that, lowering in depression scores would be comparable, I'd have been like, not a chance. But it's true.
But it's true. Yeah.
Yeah. It's fascinating, this interaction between exercise and neurological and then psychological function and symptoms, and an unbelievable area that's becoming very compelling and hard to ignore the evidence. So, amazing area of research.
Amazing. At Medcan, we have a state-of-the-art sort of best evidence approach to weight management. And it's not about exercise. But exercise is important for managing and maintaining a healthy weight. And muscle mass, i.e. hypertrophy or gaining more muscle mass. Why does that help with weight management? Not losing weight, but maintaining a weight.
So let me say right off the bat, I think your philosophy around, exercise is spot on. I'm fond of saying that fitness and strength is made in the gym, but weight is lost in the kitchen.
Yeah.
So in other words, you got to do something diet-wise to lose weight. It's much easier to do it that way. I think the biggest thing, and one of the phenomenon that we know for sure, is that with resistance training, the more skeletal muscle you have, it's what we call a thermogenically active tissue. In other words, it burns calories. And, it's much better at doing that than body fat. So the ratio of lean or skeletal muscle to fat mass is an important predictor of your resting metabolic rate. So as we age, when we lose mass, that's going to go down.
Right.
So the best you can do to sort of retain muscle mass, the more you can keep that RMR up at a higher level and resist a little bit of weight gain. It's not the perfect formula, but it's certainly something that you can do to push back against that for sure.
Makes sense. Thermogenic muscle mass that can burn more energy helps to improve and maintain those healthy weight goals, and also helps for other things like diabetes management and metabolic disease in general, or metabolic syndrome.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that. We have a paper, it should come out probably close to the end of this year, looking at risk factors for things like you said, like diabetes and metabolic syndrome. And interestingly enough, it's one area where aerobic exercise was often, touted as the therapy for that. But resistance exercise is actually comparable. In other words, you get the same lowering of risk. Do both, you get an even further lowering. So it's an interesting observation. It probably has to do with, the biggest sink you have for disposal of blood glucose is muscle.
Right.
So make it active and make it as big as possible. And you've got a bigger sink and you can dispose of it. And it doesn't do all the bad things that happen when you leave it in circulation.
Fantastic. Now, I'm going to loop this back to some practical stuff. Being an educator, and over the years in your research working with different populations, so males and females and young and the old, what are some basic recommendations you would give to get someone started in resistance training?
So I think the basic thing you have to define for yourself is that you're going to make the time to do the activity. I think that's a fundamental sort of grounding principle, in other words, and that in doing so, you realize that there's benefit associated with it, and you're going to commit, and this is all a goal-setting behavior change type thing, to something that's realistic, manageable, and you know what it is that you're going to get out of it. I'm going to be stronger. I need to be stronger because I want to do X, or that I just have a long-term, I appreciate the health benefits, and so I'm going to do this. After that, it's all a matter of, I think, means. In other words, do you have the means to afford a gym membership? And if you do, that's great. I mentioned the use of, resistance bands. They've improved a lot over the last, I would say, 10 to 15 years.
Yeah.
And they can give you a strengthening workout that is, certainly pushes the needle of the, something much better than nothing.
Right.
Consistent with your goals. So if money is a barrier, then I think resistance bands. If time is a barrier, there are so many free resources now on the internet and all kinds of places to look up workouts. The biggest thing in the end is ultimately to make yourself accountable to someone. Well, you as the first person, but maybe there's somebody else who shares your goal or supports your goal. And I think that that's a really big part around making a behavior change. If you have any hesitancy, or you have an orthopedic issue that is going to stop you, or you have knee osteoarthritis and, you're just like, I don't want to be in pain. Certainly nobody does. then consult a professional. And I think that's, it's another means issue. If you have the means to get a personal trainer, it can be highly motivating. Tell them what your goals are. Yeah. Find someone hopefully that you're compatible with on a personality level. And it's like, I like the way that we work out together and you show me this. I love your explanations, whatever it is. I'm sure that's a mantra at Medcan, right?
It is, yeah.
So when I'm like, I can't do this, they're like, yes, you can. And other people are like, I want nothing like that. I just want somebody to, support me in what I'm doing. And on days when I don't feel good, to just say, that's okay.
Yeah.
It's got to be a very personal touch on how it is that you program for individuals. Very much the same way as you would approach just about any behavior change. Resistance exercise, though, requires maybe a little bit more thought because the standard prescription is go for a walk.
Yeah.
For an older person, I have a colleague at Waterloo who is fond of saying that actually may be not a particularly good piece of advice. In other words, you may be exposing yourself to a greater risk for a fall by doing that.
Yeah, and certain people for sure.
It doesn't reduce your fall risk. So we have the evidence on that. So being stronger, having balance work, that reduces your fall risk. Walking doesn't.
Yeah, excellent point.
So where are you in the spectrum? And what is it that you want to achieve?
That makes a lot of sense. But oftentimes patients, again, and these are patients that may not be exercisers, right? So exercising or doing even rehab exercise isn't part of their mental makeup. Like this, they're just like, yeah. And I had a patient come in and said, don't give me exercise. Like walked in the door, I'm not going to do that. And now she's a regular exercise. So now she goes to the gym 3-4 times a week. She does cardio, she does weight, it's changed her life. But sometimes when I get people started on things, I do what's called an unstructured rehabilitation program where I give them the exercises. And I usually give them descriptions and take them through it and give them pictures and things. And I tell them to cut out this exercise and stick it somewhere where you're going to see it. And so I try to get people to just so when you see it, do it.
Yeah. It's an interesting approach. And one of the things that I think most people don't appreciate is now with our 24-hour movement guidelines, or used to be our physical activity guidelines, one of the things that's emphasized is that it doesn't have to be continuous exercise. And one of the buzzwords is an exercise snack in the middle of a day. Just first getting up. You and I were sitting here talking to each other, sitting on chairs, right? And so you have to be conscious to get up and move around. But maybe, like a little, 10 body weight squats. And everybody goes, it's kind of weird. And I'm like, yeah, maybe you feel that way. But when we look at our older folks here, people with osteoarthritis, which is, it's endemic. It's just part of aging, feel that it's going to create more pain. And the reality is the opposite is true, particularly when it's appropriately managed. And so as you point out, particularly in people who are in chronic pain, if you can nudge them down from that, and most people in that situation are very kinesiophobic. They don't want to move.
Yeah, fear of exercise, fear of movement.
That actually probably, it makes it worse.
Yeah, that's our approach with chronic pain and osteoarthritis here, because that's what the science supports, yeah. Thank you, Dr. Stuart Phillips. It's been great talking to you. And thanks again for coming back on Eat, Move, Think. And I'm hoping all of our listeners start to think about, if they haven't already, they start to engage in some level of resistance training and hit to that target of twice per week.
That'd be a fantastic outcome.
So great. Thank you for your time.
Yeah, you're most welcome.
That was Dr. Andrew Miners, Medcan's Director of Sports Medicine, Therapy, Rehabilitation, and Fitness, in conversation with Dr. Stuart Phillips, Professor of Kinesiology and the Director of the PACE Lab at McMaster University. That's the Physical Activity Center of Excellence. You can book a consultation or a personal training session with a Medcan trainer by emailing fitness@medcan.com. Follow Medcan on Twitter and Instagram at MedcanLiveWell, and follow Dr. Stuart Phillips on Twitter and Instagram at MackinProf. That's MACKINPROF. We'll be posting episode highlights and other links that you can visit on our website, eatmovethinkpodcast.com. Say hello and send us a tip or a suggestion by emailing us at info@eatmovethinkpodcast.com. Eat, Move, Think is produced by Ghost Bureau. I'm Jasmine Ratch, managing producer. Social media and strategy support is from Chantel Gertin, Andrew Imex, and Emily Bozick, and Christopher Shulgin is executive producer. We'll be back soon with a new episode examining the latest in health and wellness. See you soon. This podcast episode is intended to provide general information about health and wellness only and is not designed or intended to constitute or be used as a substitute for medical advice, treatment, or diagnosis. You should always talk to your Medcan healthcare provider for individual medical advice, diagnosis, and treatment, including your specific health and wellness needs. This podcast is based on the information available at the time of preparation and is only accurate and current as of that date. Source information and recommendations are subject to change based on scientific evidence as it evolves over time. Medcan is not responsible for future changes or updates to the information and recommendations and assumes no obligation to update based on future developments. Reference to or mention of specific treatments or therapies does not constitute or imply a recommendation or endorsement. The links provided within the associated document are to assist the reader with any specific information highlighted. Any third-party links are not endorsed by Medcan.